On the morning of January 2nd, 1978, a woman in California received a call asking for someone named Ray. She didn't know anyone by that name, so she simply told the caller they had the wrong number and hung up. Back then, callers had to manually enter each digit of the number they wanted to call in a rotary phone, and accidentally entering the wrong number was a common mistake. So she didn't think much of this and moved on with her day. However, things took a horrifying turn that evening when she received another call from the same person. And what she heard on the other end of this audio call was extremely disturbing.
Hello? Hello?
The man who was politely asking to speak with someone named Ray earlier was now threatening to end her life. What's worse is that this audio call wasn't a baseless threat or a troll. The person calling was later found out to be the Golden State Killer, one of the most infamous serial killers in US history. He terrorized California for over a decade from 1974 to 1986 and operated across multiple counties, including Sacramento, Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Orange County. What made him more terrifying than most other serial killers was just how precise and thorough he was. Instead of committing the crime whenever he got the chance, he would often plan months in advance. He would stalk his victims, learning everything about their daily lives and routines to find the right opportunity. This also included surveying the area around their home to plan escape routes. Sometimes he would break into his victims' homes beforehand to unlock windows, unload guns, and plant the gear he was later going to use for the crime. He would also call his future victims many times leading up to the crime and threaten them, similar to the call you heard earlier. This was all a part of his act, with these calls serving as a way for him to mentally torment his victims ahead of time. When he eventually broke into their home for the last time, he would often tie them up and make himself at home, even cooking in their kitchen on occasion. Put simply, he was extremely confident in his planning, and unfortunately it worked. By the end of 1986, he had broken into different homes over 120 times, and in more than 64 victims, 3 of which were children. However, despite the authorities having tons of evidence against him, like fingerprints, footprints, masks, multiple rings, and many different sketches from witnesses, nothing led to a name. He would even call and taunt the police and families of his victims, daring them to catch him. But despite all this, the case remained cold for over 40 years. That is, until the late 2010s, when a new kind of detective work changed everything. You see, investigators already had plenty of DNA evidence from the killer. However, his DNA didn't match the limited samples they had in their database. But in 2016, a very distant relative of the Golden State Killer took a DNA ancestry test through one of the companies like 23andMe. The DNA data from this company was aggregated by a company called GED Match. And the FBI then used this extensive database to see if any of the samples matched with the DNA evidence they had. While they didn't find the killer, they did find a match with one of his very distant relatives. This allowed them to go through the whole family tree with over 1,000 members and eventually find the person they were looking for. After 40 long years, the identity of the man behind this creepy call was finally made public. On April 24, 2018, authorities arrested then 73-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. He was a Vietnam War veteran and an ex-police officer from the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. Investigation of his past also revealed a chilling instance from July 1979 when he was arrested for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. In hindsight, it's obvious that he was going to use both of these items for one of his crimes. And the reason he tried to steal them instead of paying was because he didn't want the sale tied back to his name in any way. In July of 2020, Joseph pled guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping in a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. He was given 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole and is now serving his time at a California state prison. The recorded audio calls he made to his soon-to-be victims have gone down as some of the most disturbing pieces of audio ever recorded. On the 1st of December 2017, Reddit user Drudagon17 made a Reddit post hoping to find an explanation for the terrifying screams he heard while on vacation. What's causing these screams? So I'm not really sure what this is. I've had a lot of people tell me different things, but no one really knows for sure. Maybe someone here could help me shed some light. Alongside this, he linked to a recording of what sounded like a person screaming at the top of their lungs. The OP then went into detail describing the circumstances surrounding these disturbing noises, reading, "Earlier in the year, I went on a long road trip across the states, mainly visiting the national parks and a few cities along the way. Towards the end of the trip, we found ourselves staying in the small town of West Yellowstone. This appeared to be an ideal base whilst we explored Yellowstone National Park. We booked into a pretty creepy but cheap motel just off the main street for a couple of nights. Me and my fiancé had one room, my parents another. On the first morning there, we planned to get up early, catch the sunrise, and hopefully spot some of the local wildlife. So our alarms were set for 5 a.m. At about 4:45 a.m., I was woken by loud banging on the door, followed by crying and shouting. I instantly jumped out of my bed thinking the worst had happened. I opened the door to my mom in a state of panic, saying, "There's someone screaming, a woman screaming." There, clear as day, I could hear a woman screaming. It sounded as though it was within 100 feet of us. Mom claimed it had been happening for the last 30 minutes. We wanted to call the police but had no phone signal, no phones in the rooms, and we were the only people about. This on its own is pretty terrifying, but what made this encounter even more unnerving was what happened next, with the OP and his family having a very bizarre interaction with local law enforcement, stating, "Then, after I'd been hearing the scream for about half an hour, so roughly an hour since it started, a police officer seemed to appear out of nowhere. He started to ask questions about what we were doing and why we were up. We thought he'd come about the scream, so we quickly told him everything. He then heard the scream and sped off towards town. The screaming got less frequent and eventually stopped, so we decided to go about our day. We saw all the lovely sights of Yellowstone and even showed several park rangers the video to see if it's an animal. They all said they've not heard anything like it before. So when we got back into town that evening, we stopped into the sheriff's office to try and get some information. This was met with a lot of hostility from both the lady at reception, who eventually closed the shutter in our face, and the same officer we had seen that morning. They both said exactly the same thing. It almost sounded like a script. "Sorry ma'am, but that was an intoxicated woman yelling for her boyfriend." I don't quite understand how they can put that down to someone shouting at their boyfriend. I get people get really wasted, but not to the point where you just scream and never say any words. So, what was the source of the disturbing screaming Dredagon heard that night? The most prevalent theory I've come across is that these noises were coming from an animal, more specifically a mountain lion. This makes a lot of sense since mountain lions are native to the Yellowstone wilderness. More importantly, their screams are eerily similar to what the OP heard during his stay in that area. That said, it's still possible that the police officers were telling the truth and that these screams were coming from an intoxicated woman. The pitch of the second scream in the OP's recording in particular is a lot more human-like than something coming from an animal. One person on YouTube even tried to explain this uncanny difference, stating that the first round of screaming sounds like it's coming from a mountain lion, and the second time sounds like a person screaming back at the animal. Maybe they were just annoyed and were trying to scare away the animal or get it to shut up. While this could have been the case, most of the screaming noises OP heard were likely coming from a mountain lion, since according to his post, he didn't hear any cries for help or other words in these noises. Even if it were coming from a highly intoxicated woman, it's safe to assume that she would say something aside from just yelling at the top of her lungs. But if that's true, why did two different police officers tell the same lie? Some people speculated that they did so just to avoid scaring off tourists, or that they were just pulling a prank. But from what I've seen, Dredagon was most likely lying about this part of his story. It's entirely possible that after learning about the surprisingly normal origin of these creepy noises, the OP used this encounter to craft a disturbing story they could post on Reddit. especially since at one point during his original post he mentions showing the recording to multiple park rangers. Now, even if these rangers weren't 100% positive, they would still make the obvious connection with the similar animal noise that's common in that region. Dronigan also mentioned looking it up on YouTube and not finding any videos that could explain the disturbing screams. Even though when searching "screaming in Yellowstone" on YouTube, one of the first results is a 9-year-old video showcasing a mountain lion scream. That being said, it's been over 7 years since the original post, and Dronigan hasn't posted any updates since. So whether this was a mountain lion or something else more disturbing, we'll likely never know the truth with 100% certainty. In February 2016, the residents of Forest Grove, Oregon began hearing a strange, high-pitched noise in the area. This eerie noise was limited to the city of Forest Grove and the wilderness surrounding it. It could only be heard for a few minutes at a time. It would begin blaring randomly throughout the day and often late into the night before going away for a few hours. One of the most disturbing aspects of this noise was how quickly it spread to the entire city. Its tone was deeply uncomfortable, resulting in a lot of people calling the police in distress.
It's happened twice tonight. It's happened about 5 times during the last 7 days, and the neighbor beside me, we can't even hear each other in the backyard. Neither one of us can figure out what's happening.
Throughout that February, emergency services received over 200 calls from concerned citizens, some even reporting physical symptoms from hearing the noise. But one question was on everyone's mind: where was this screeching noise coming from? One of the first theories that came up was that the noise was coming from a gas leak, something that could possibly be that loud. However, the Northwest Natural Gas Company quickly shut down this idea, stating that if there was a gas leak, they would have become aware of it already. Also, a gas leak sounds more like a jet taking off rather than the screeching sound reported. On top of that, they pointed out that if there was a gas leak big enough to cause this much noise, the smell of the leaking gas would spread throughout the city as well. Another theory that came up was that this was the result of trapped air and sewer lines escaping through a manhole. However, a major flaw in this theory was that if it were true, why did the noise only begin in February of 2016? The fire marshal, on the other hand, suggested the idea that it might be coming from someone's faulty air conditioning system. This is because many dysfunctional systems emit a very high-frequency sound, similar to what the residents of Forest Grove were hearing. The truth is, this noise could have been coming from any number of sources, including construction equipment or a broken emergency siren. Unfortunately, the sound appeared to be coming from all directions, making it pretty much impossible to find its origin and verify any of these theories. While everyone was desperately trying to figure things out, the daily noise was becoming more and more unsettling with each passing day. But the eerie noise then suddenly disappeared just as quickly as it had begun. Over 9 years later, and this strange noise is still an unsolved mystery. That said, I believe the most likely theory is also the most boring one, that this whole thing was a prank or hoax by someone with a horn of some kind. You see, after getting overwhelmed by the number of calls from Forest Grove residents, the local police station began investigating the phenomenon more seriously. Amid their search, they put out a statement warning any potential pranksters, reading, "While some might find it comical, interesting, and mysterious, it's unlawful if it's being done on purpose. If this is the case, the individual caught will face possible repercussions." A couple days after this statement came out, the noise vanished and hasn't returned since. It's almost as if whoever was behind this realized that the prank was not worth the trouble and stopped. Of course, all this is just a theory on its own. But unless someone comes forward with a confession, I doubt we'll ever learn the truth about the origin of this disturbing noise. On March 2nd, 2013, an anonymous user made an entry on 4chan talking about a creepy radio hijacking they experienced as a kid. The post read, "A creepy, I think, audio file which I've always been curious about. Back in 1994/1995, when I recorded this off of the radio, I told myself I'd never make a copy of the tape, having freaked myself out. But it's been sitting in the back of a desk drawer and in the back of my mind for 16 years now, and now I'm just curious. The weird stuff starts about 16 seconds in. Around 1995, I was about 15. I used to stay up late in my room listening to the radio on a boombox with an integrated tape recorder. I'd dial through the stations, and when I heard something interesting, I'd hit record for a while and then move on. One night, I came across this. I don't think this was the beginning of the broadcast, but I caught a lot of it. Right at the end, an announcer says that the station I was tuned to was WKCR 89.9 New York. There are a bunch of names and dates in there, but I've never run into anything else like this. Alongside this was a link to an audio file that starts off quite normal with a section from a 1993 song by Billy Cobham. It then abruptly transitions into a violin section from a song called Golden Sonata by Henry Purcell. The audio then morphs into a bone-chilling, high-pitched scream of sorts. This alone is extremely creepy, but the audio doesn't stop there. Soon after this high-pitched scream, it morphs into the sound of a woman taking deep breaths. This breathing pattern repeats a few times, ultimately leading into the sound of a woman reading seemingly random names and dates in an almost whisper. This voice keeps repeating the same 9 names and dates over and over again. A little investigation shows that the names and dates are taken from their obituaries. The 2 most notable names among these belong to Frank Oppenheimer, the brother of the creator of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Barry Joseph Valentino Jr., one of the victims of the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing in 1988. However, from what I've seen, there's no correlation between any of the names besides the fact that they're all dead. After repeating these names for a few minutes, the broadcast goes back to normal with a seemingly routine call sign announcement.
You're tuned to WKCR-FM New York, 89.9 on your dial. Colombian music is running a little late. It will be starting in a few minutes.
Now, when the anonymous user originally posted this on 4chan, it received mixed reactions. Some people were deeply creeped out by it, while others were skeptical and believed the OP made this whole thing up. So, what's the truth? Well, there's evidence supporting both sides of the argument. The thing is, after receiving a few requests, the OP posted the full audio clip on YouTube with a channel named Ravenmouth. Searching it on Google shows that the OP has a Reddit account by the same name. With this, we can see that a couple of weeks after his 4chan post, Ravenmouth posted the same radio hijacking story on the No Sleep subreddit, which is mainly about believable but not always true disturbing stories. Near the end of this post, Ravenmouth also added a new section that wasn't present in his 4chan post, reading, "Unfortunately, and for this I sincerely apologize, it never ever stops. I told you this was just something I'd found, and I swear to you that that's true. It really did happen that way. It's more than that though. I don't really know how long it takes. A few weeks or months from now when you're alone and suddenly you hear the keening, quavering sound rise up like it's crawling out of your spine and into your skull, you'll understand. When that night comes, if you listen closely to what comes after the horrible sound, you'll realize that the woman will be reading your name, new names. You'll play it for your friends, your family, add their names. I hope, desperately, that if I can make the list long enough, add enough names, then they'll take mine off and leave me alone. I'm sorry." This is plenty of evidence to show that this story is fictional and Ravenmouth made it all up. However, he remains adamant that while he did embellish the story a bit for the Reddit post, he still did record the audio from the radio when he was a teenager. So, could the WKCR station have actually been hijacked by someone? It's entirely possible. Radio hijackings are not a new phenomenon, and were certainly a thing back when this would have happened. But WKCR is owned by a college, and ran almost entirely by college students. When asked about it, the WKCR team stated, "As far as we know, this did take place on WKCR airwaves. In terms of the claim that it was a hijacking, that is very unlikely. WKCR is a weird place with weird programmers, probably just some late-night new music programmer having fun on the mic." Put simply, Ravenmouth was likely telling the truth, but what he thought was a creepy hijacking was just the artsy experiment of a college student. Although this, of course, cannot be 100% confirmed. On March 1st, 1999, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded an ominous sound coming from the ocean. This is what it sounds like at 16 times speed. This sound, named Julia, lasted for a whole 2 minutes and 43 seconds and was powerful enough to be detected across the entire equatorial Pacific Ocean hydrophone network. Hydrophones, for those who don't know, are basically underwater microphones. They were originally installed to detect submarines during the Cold War and were later converted to be used for general ocean research. This network became popular in 1997 when it captured multiple strange sounds coming from within the ocean, including the now iconic bloop. According to the official explanation, the sound heard in this recording was caused by ice quakes and large icebergs, or by icebergs scraping the ocean floor. Julia was recorded nearly 2 years after this one. However, unlike bloop, it doesn't have an explanation. Due to the high loudness of Julia, scientists weren't able to pinpoint its exact location. One potential solution that's been floating on the internet for a while now is that Julia originated from underwater volcanic activity. Sadly, this theory falls apart quickly upon inspection. This is mainly because there was also recorded audio coming from an underwater volcano called Upsweep, and it sounds nothing like Julia. A somewhat more interesting theory that tries to explain Julia is that the sound originates from an unknown sea creature. And while this does sound like science fiction at best, it feels a lot more feasible when you consider the fact that we're yet to explore over 80% of the ocean in detail. However, the very idea of an ocean creature big enough to produce a sound audible from thousands of kilometers away is terrifying, and honestly quite out there. The sound dubbed Julia is one of many underwater sounds recorded that have yet to be identified.